First Kings, chapter 17. And in preparing this lesson, you always try to come up with a good title. And, one of those that goes with the lesson but also grabs attention. And I just couldn't come up with one. So I went back and forth between two. So I guess the one I settled on, the one I typed on my paper, is The Reward of Obedience. And but as I was studying this lesson, I thought I could go in different ways with this lesson. And so I know where I'm going, so I know when I get there. But I think you can take from this lesson what you need this morning. You can take different things from it. But 1 Kings chapter 17, and I'm going to read in verse 8 through 17. And the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, Arise, get thee to Zarephath, which belongeth to Zidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow woman there to sustain thee. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, behold, the widow woman was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Fetch me, I pray thee, a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And she said, and as she was going to fetch it, he called to her and said, Bring me, I pray thee, a morsel of bread in thine hand. And she said, As the Lord thy God liveth, I have not a cake, but a handful of meal in a barrel, and a little oil in a cruse. And behold, I am gathering 2 sticks, that I may go in and dress it for me and my son, that we may eat it and die. And Elijah said unto her, Fear not, go and do as thou hast said, but make me thereof a little cake first, and bring it unto me, and after make for thee and for thy son. For thus saith the Lord God of Israel, The barrel of meal shall not waste, neither shall the cruse of oil fail, until the day that the Lord sendeth rain upon the earth. And she went and did according to the saying of Elijah, and she and he and her house did eat many days. And the barrel of meal wasted not, neither did the cruse of oil fail, according to the word of the Lord which he spake by Elijah. I want to read verse 1 in this same chapter. And Elijah the Tishbite, who was of the inhabitants of Gilead, said unto Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not dew nor rain these years, but according to my word. So in this scripture, you can go back and you can read the stories up to this point. But in this scripture, at this point in the story, Elijah has prophesied that there will be no rain in the land. And he didn't say how long, he said years. And to turn out, it was about 3.5 years that it did not rain on the land. And so at this point, Elijah is saying there's going to be no rain. Now, Elijah went, and God told Elijah, prophesy this, and then you're going to have to leave because everybody's going to be after you. So God told Elijah to go to the brook of Cherith, and he would sustain him there. And so Elijah went, and he was at the brook of Cherith. And in my research, I got to thinking, how long was he at the brook of Cherith before he had to go back into town to a widow woman to sustain him? He was there about a year. And so he was at the brook Cherith for about a year, and God sustained him. God chose to use ravens to bring bread and meat to him every morning and every day. So Elijah, for a full year, ravens fed him. Birds brought him food for a full year. And I got to thinking about that, and I was like, Lord, I don't think I would want to eat from a raven, but if that's how he decided to provide for me, it's a great miracle. Because a raven, first of all, birds are going to fend for themselves first. But God commanded that bird to give his food to the man of God. And so when you look at that, it's like, Lord, that was a great miracle in itself. But eventually, now, I really got to thinking, what would happen in our land if we had no rain? Now, verse number 1, I read it because of this. Because this morning, as I was restudying and going over my lesson, I read verse 1, and it says there would be no dew nor rain. And so I thought, well, okay, what's the point of dew besides messing up your shoes when you're trying to go to church in the morning? You have to walk through the grass, and it gets you all wet and dirty, right? What's the point of dew? Well, dew sustains plants when there is times of no rain. The dew is what makes that, it waters the plants every morning. God waters our world with dew every morning. So when Elijah said there would be no dew nor rain, what did that truly mean? Because I've said this before, y'all have heard me say it before. We can read this story and we can think, what if I was there? What if I was this widow woman? How would I have reacted? What would I have said to Elijah? And most of us, I would have fed him. I would have fed him. I would have gave him. I would have done what God said. But would you have really? Put yourself this morning. So this morning, as we're going through this story, put yourself in this woman's place. Walk in her shoes this morning. Because would you have really given to him your last bit of food? Because what happens in a drought? What is a drought? A drought is a period of dryness, right? What would happen if there was no rain on this earth? Just for 1 year. This was 3.5 years. For 1 year, what would happen? All of our grass would die. It would turn to hay. Our world would become a desert. Even our deserts that are used to no rain would die. Because the little bit of rain that a desert does get is what sustains it. So when you take that away, it's gone, and that desert begins to dry. There becomes wildfires that consumes everything in its path. The air becomes so dusty and so dry, it makes it hard to breathe. When all of the plants are now dead, because it's been a year of no rain, when all the plants are now dead, the oxygen in the air actually decreases, making it harder to breathe. Within a full 3 years of no rain, carbon monoxide increases in our air, making the air that we breathe almost toxic. This was the point that they were getting to. So this woman, when she said, I have no food, she truly meant it. Because if you remember, this was a widow woman. This widow woman probably did not work a job. Her food probably came from gleaning on the ends of the fields. If you remember the story of Ruth, when she would go and glean in the fields, that's what this widow woman did. The things that the gleaners dropped, that's what her food was. So when there's no rain, there's no crops. When there's no crops, there's no food. When there's no rain, there's nothing to sustain the earth, much less the people in it. We as humans can go about 3 days without water. We can survive about 3 weeks without food. Some of us a little more. But we can only live for 3 days without water. So when there's no rain, everything around us begins to die. So I want you to imagine where our world is right now with no rain. Because we're in her shoes. We are putting ourselves in her place this morning. And so the drought has gotten so bad that within 1 year, this has been 1 year when Elijah came to her, within a year her food source is gone. She realizes that I am going to die. People around her have probably already died. All of the animals around her have already died. If there's no rain, all of the animals will die. And then the animals that die pollute the little bit of water that we do find. All of the lakes, the ponds, the rivers, even the ocean suffers when there is no rain. If we had no rain for 3 years, the ocean, water evaporates. Science lesson this morning. Water evaporates. The ocean water evaporates. The rain replenishes that. If there's no rain to replenish what evaporates, the salt in the ocean becomes greater. It increases. Fish will actually begin to die. So we think, oh, we can go to the ocean. There's plenty of water. No, you won't. That water becomes almost lethal to everything inside of that ocean. This is what would happen. So again, I'm asking you this morning, if you were this widow woman, how would you have responded to Elijah? You have a little son. You have a child. And this child, now, this widow woman, I've really put myself in her place when I was studying this. And this widow woman has been rationing what little food she had for a full year now. So for a full year, she's been hungry. Her child has been hungry. And so in my imagination and in my mind, I see this child as he says, Mama, can I have just a little bit more today? Just a little bit, Mama. My stomach hurts. I'm so hungry. How many of us, as I was studying this lesson, I got hungry. And my stomach was hurting. I was so hungry. And I thought, this woman was in pain constantly from hunger. This child was in pain constantly from hunger. Because I had not eaten it was lunchtime and I don't eat breakfast, so it had been the night before, but I ate plenty the day before, but I was hungry. And my stomach, you know how your stomach begins to you think you're starving to death. I mean, Mama, I'm starving. This baby was literally starving. And I see him as maybe he's crying at night, Mama, I'm just hungry. And she can't give him what he wants. She can't give him what he needs. And she says, baby, we'll have a little bit more tomorrow. So this day that God spoke to Elijah and said, go unto Zarephath, because there's a widow woman that I've commanded to sustain thee. God had not spoken to this widow woman. God didn't tell her, you're going to give your last bit of food to the man of God. He had not done that for her. So Elijah comes to the gate of the city, and this widow woman is outside of the gate gathering sticks, and she said she's gathering 2 sticks. 2 sticks to make a fire, to cook a last meal. 2 sticks isn't a whole lot of fire. In my mind, it's not a whole lot of fire. So it's not a whole lot of food she's going to be cooking. And so she's at this place and she looks. Elijah comes and he says, can you give me just a little bit of water? She doesn't hesitate. She doesn't question. She goes to get him water. So there's still some water in the land. There's still some drinking water. And she doesn't hesitate to give him that little bit of life. And so she goes to get him water and he stops her. And he says, bring me a little cake to eat too, or a little bread. And that stops her. She hesitates. And she said, as the Lord thy God liveth, I don't have a cake. All I have is a little bit of meal and a little bit of oil. And I'm gathering 2 sticks. I'm going to cook it, and me and my son are going to die. The reward of obedience. And he tells her, he says, don't fear. Now, I stopped here for a minute in my study, and I thought, this widow woman, she said, as the Lord thy God liveth. So she knew who Elijah was. She knew that he was the prophet of the one true God. She knew that. But she still hesitated because she has this little baby at home that's been crying that he's hungry. She knows what it really means to be starving. She realizes I'm going to die because I have nothing left. And you're asking me for that last little bit. So in my mind, I thought, well, did she think, well, I'm going to die anyway. I might as well just give it to him. Maybe. Or maybe there was a little bit of faith, a little bit of hope that this man was a true man of God. That this man, the prophet of the God of Israel, was telling me the truth when he said, fear not. Go and do as you said. Go and cook for you and your son, but fix for me first. And he told her, he said, the barrel would not fail and the cruse of oil would not fail. And she went and she did it. She hesitated, but she still held on to that little bit of hope. Now, if you go on down into this chapter, and I didn't read the story after this, if you go down into this, Elijah is living with this woman and her son. And so this barrel of meal has sustained her and him and her child. And the Bible said in her house. So this barrel of meal is sustaining them throughout this time. I don't know. The Bible doesn't say that. Elijah never said it's going to be 3 years or 3.5 years. He didn't say that, but it was 2.5 more years before it rained. So this barrel of meal lasted 2.5 years. So question I have for you this morning is, did this barrel of meal just fill up and stay full the entire 2.5 years? Or was there just a handful every day? Every time she went to that barrel, was it just a handful? The same amount that she had that she fixed for the 3 of them. Every time she reached in it, she pulled out another handful. It's a question you have to answer. I believe, and in my mind, I believe that every day that she went to that barrel, there was a handful of meal. There was enough for that day. There was enough every time that she went to that barrel and that she took that cruse of oil and poured it into that frying pan to make that cornbread. I like cornbread. And she poured it in there every time. It looked like she was going to empty it every single time. But every time she would get up, and now for 2.5 years, how many of you go into a room and flip on a light switch and expect the lights to come on? Y'all, my lights were out the other day. They were doing maintenance on the lines or something. I still went in the room and flipped the light switch. It's just, I expected lights to come on even though I knew they weren't going to come on. So after 2.5 years, it was probably one of those things she just expected it to be. But in my mind's eye, I want to see this woman as she goes every morning and she's like, is it going to be there today? Is there going to be enough for us today? And as she looks and she pulls the lid off of that barrel and she looks and there's just another handful of meal. And God has done it once again every day. It took faith for this woman to give her last bit of meal to the man of God. It took faith for her to go and fix food for him first. And it took faith every time she went to that barrel to fix another meal. It took faith. Just as our walk in God takes faith every day, we know that every time I go and I flip that light switch, light should come on. And I know just with that same surety that every time I go before God and I ask him for something, that he hears my prayer. He may not choose to answer me the way I want him to. Because this woman probably would have felt better if that barrel had just been full, overflowing, and never went diminished. It wouldn't have taken as much faith if it had just been overflowing full. But when you're depending upon something and depending upon God for your very life, it takes faith to walk every day. The reward of obedience, if we read the rest of this chapter, we see where this woman's son has died. He gets sick and he dies. And she looks at Elijah and she says, basically, in my words, she says, why? I've done what you've asked me to do. I gave you what I thought was my last meal. You've lived all of this time with me. Why? Why are you doing this? Why is God doing this? And Elijah takes the son and he takes him to the room that he's staying in, and he prays over this child. And he prays again and again. 3 times that he lays on this child and prays for this child, and the child comes back to life, and he takes the baby and he gives it back to his mama. And the thing that she says in verse 24, and the woman said to Elisha, now by this I know that thou art a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in thy mouth is truth. Now, this woman was willing to give him water when he asked for it. This woman was willing, after some prodding, to give him her last bit of meal, to make him that meal first. This woman has allowed him to stay with him and has cooked for him and helped him all of this time. And now her son is dead. By faith, she goes to that barrel every day and takes a little bit of meal out and fixes. By faith, she has allowed Elijah to stay there. And now by faith, her son is dead. And she says, why? But because of her obedience in the little things, because of her obedience and providing for Elijah, God has given back her son. Now, you are in her shoes this morning. How would you have reacted to Elijah's original request? So by now, it has not rained for 2 to 3 years. Everything around me is dead. Most of my friends are more than likely dead. And yet God has allowed me to survive. All of the animals that we once had is dead. More than likely, the land just stinks with death. But God has provided me a way to survive. There's times that we go through spiritual droughts in life. And sometimes we wonder why. Why am I in this place? But God has provided a way for you to survive this drought. God has provided a way for you to come through all of this. Sometimes life is just life. Time and chance happeneth to them all. Sometimes life just happens and it's not fun. And sometimes we have to question, why am I in this place? Why am I here? So this morning, as you're putting yourself in this woman's shoes and you're walking for a full year without rain or even dew on the land, and so everything around you is dead, all of the plants, everything is turned to desert. And God's asked you to give what you do have. God's asked you to give of yourself. What do you say? What would you do? The reward of obedience, her reward was life. Your reward for obedience is life. Eternal life in a home that we can't even imagine. Now I want to turn to Luke chapter 5, verse 4. Now when he had left speaking, he said unto Simon, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draught. And Simon answering said unto him, Master, we have toiled all the night, and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word I will let down the net. And when they had done this, they enclosed a great multitude of fishes, and their net brake. And they beckoned unto their partners which were in the other ship, that they should come and help them. And they came and filled both the ships, so that they began to sink. In this scripture, we see there's Peter and the sons of Zebedee, and they have been fishing. They've been fishing all night. And Jesus has come, and the crowd is pressing around him, and they want to hear him teach. So Jesus has seen Peter. He's seen the boats. He said, hey, can you just push your boat out a little bit and let me just teach off of your boat? And so Peter willingly never questions it. He's, just goes out in just a little ways. And Jesus stands there and he teaches the multitude of people. So after he ends his teaching, and this is where we are now, he looks at Peter, or Simon at the time, and he says, launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a draught. Now, the first part of this says they've been fishing, they've come in, and they're washing their nets. So they have done fished. And so I thought, well, why'd they fish at night? And in this lake, which was the Sea of Galilee, but it was too small to be the sea, so it's a lake, and I can't really pronounce the name of it, so I'm not even going to try. So they are here, and they are fishing, and they have fished all night. And so when I researched this part of this lesson, it said that fishing was best at night in this lake. And so these men have been up all night long. They have been fishing all night long, and they have caught absolutely nothing. You that like to fish, have you ever gone out and caught nothing? It's just a little bit disappointing, isn't it? I don't like it. If I go fishing, I want to bring home something. And if I'm not fishing, I got a book I can sit here and read or something. But if I'm not catching something, then let's do something else. So these men have fished all night, but this was their livelihood. They depended on every single fish that they caught to provide for them, for their families, and for their home. This was how they made their money. So they have fished all night and caught nothing, which means they've made no money. They have worked all night long and not made not one penny. Now, I would not like to go to a job and work 8 hours and not make any money for doing it. Most of us wouldn't. But this is exactly what they did. They worked all night long and caught nothing. So they have come back into land, and they have washed and cleaned up their boats. They're getting ready to go home for the day. Now, they've been up all night long. They're ready to go home. And Jesus says, let me teach off your boat. And he says, okay. So when he says, launch out, cast your nets, and pull in a draught of fish, Peter says, we fished all night long. There's no fish out there. If they weren't biting at night, they're surely not going to be biting now. And he says, this word is what I want you to hear. Nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the net. That word, nevertheless, means in spite of. In spite of the fact we fished all night, in spite of the fact I've done everything I know to do and have caught nothing, in spite of that, I will do what you've told me to do. Now, they've already washed their nets. Growing up, I grew up on the bayous of Louisiana, and my grandfather was a fisherman, and he had nets that he fished with. But these nets were probably the length of the width of this church, because he would take them when he would have to repair the nets. He would take them and he would string them across the yard, and he would repair those nets. And I don't know how often he did it. I just remember the nets but these nets were huge nets. And so these men have already washed these nets. And so you're asking me to take my nets that I've already washed, my boat that I've already cleaned up. I'm ready to go home. I'm ready for a bath. I'm ready for some sleep. You're asking me to do this. In spite of all of that, I will. And so they do, and he takes all of these fish, and the nets break, and it almost sank 2 ships for all of the fish that they caught. Nevertheless, going back to the widow woman and Elijah, that woman said, nevertheless, I will fix for you. In spite of the fact that I'm gathering 2 sticks, in spite of the fact that I'm going to die, in spite of the fact that everybody around me, all of the animals are dying, everything has turned to desert, in spite of all of that, I will be obedient to God. So in the time of your spiritual drought, in the times that you've worked all night, you've done everything you know to do, and you're not getting anywhere, and you're not doing anything that you think you should be doing, in spite of my life circumstances, in spite of all of that, God, I will be obedient to you. In spite of it, Nevertheless, at thy word, I will. That's the prayer we should all have. That's the attitude we should all have when God has asked of us to do something that's out of my comfort zone. God, in spite of my comfort zone, in spite of where I think I should be, in spite of the world around me, in spite of the storms that I'm facing, in spite of the dryness everywhere, in spite of everyone around me leaving the church and getting out of church, and everyone my age, all of our young people, we have great young people, but there's churches that have no young people because they've all gotten out of church. In spite of all of that, God, I will do as you've asked me to do. In spite of my heritage, in spite of how I was raised, in spite of it all, God, I will do as you've asked me to do. What would you have done if you had been in that widow woman's shoes? Your baby's starving to death. What would you have done in Peter's shoes? I've worked all night, and the fish didn't bite through the night. They're not going to bite during the day. What would you have done? What do you do when God asks you to do something that's out of your comfort zone? Do you sit there and try to bargain with God? Or do you say, God, I've done what I thought I should be doing, but nevertheless, God, at thy word I will. Nevertheless, God, at thy word I will. Is doing what God asks us to do always comfortable? Nope, it's not. But the reward of your obedience is so much greater than what you could ever imagine. God, why have you chosen to sustain me through the drought that's all around me? Because of your obedience. God, why have you chosen to save me when no one else in my family has been saved? Why did you choose to do all of these things for me? It's your reward of obedience. Deuteronomy 11:26 through 28 says, Behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse. A blessing if ye obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, and a curse if you will not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside out of the way which I command you this day to go after other gods which ye have not known. It has been set before us the option to be obedient to God or not, the blessing or the curse. God created everything in our world, and we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And if you go into a study of how our bodies operate, it's amazing, and you can't not see God. But if you look at even how our atmosphere operates, how everything around us works, you see the hand of God in every aspect of our world. And God created all of it. Everything in this world he created just by speaking to it, except for one thing. There's one thing God created without speaking it into existence, and that is you. God created man from the dust of the earth that he spoke into existence. But God took his hands, the very God that spoke and said, let there be waters, and let there be dry land, and let there be light, let there be darkness, let there be stars, let there be the moons, a God by night and the sun by day. The same God that made the plants that give us oxygen and take in the carbon monoxide that's harmful to us, that spoke that into existence. God created every animal on this earth and every one in the sea, all of those great and magnificent fish and other creatures out there. God spoke it into existence. But when it came time for God to make man, he took his very hands and he molded that man. And he breathed the breath of life into the nostrils of that man. And he gave that man one thing that he gave nothing else. And that's a choice. He gave us a soul, and he gave us the choice and the option to serve him. 1 Samuel 15:22, and Samuel said, Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Romans 6:16, know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are to whom ye obey, whether of sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness. The reward of obedience, the reward for your obedience, the same as this widow woman, is life. As I just established, God gave you the option to choose whether you will serve him or not. I teach the teens sometimes, and I have tried to drill into them that you choose every day whether you will serve God or not. I don't wake up every morning and say, okay, today I'm going to serve God. I don't physically say those words, but when I wake up and I kneel down in prayer and I say, Lord, thank you for this day. And then I ask him to lead me and to guide me and to draw me closer to him. That's me saying, I choose to serve God today. I choose to live for God this day. And every day is a choice. And every day you're going to choose whether you're going to be obedient to God or not. Because God formed you with his very hands. He did not make robots. The very trees, when yesterday the wind was blowing really, really strongly, and I thought that's their way of praising God. The leaves on the trees worship God. Every animal, as the birds sing in the mornings, when you listen to those birds singing and you hear their beautiful song, that's their worship to God. The animals, you hear the sheep bleating and the goats neighing, or the horses neighing, and the goats, what sound do they make? I don't know. Yeah, bad. All of the sounds of the animals, that is their way of worshiping God. So how much more should we worship God as the very thing that God formed with his very hands? How much more should we worship God? In the drought that's all around us, how much more should we draw closer to God and drink of that living water that Christ said that he is? How much more should we work to strive and work to get toward God and be closer to him? How much more obedient should we be to him? So this morning, I've gone through my lesson, and I want to challenge each and every one of us. We've got to be obedient to God. Nevertheless, at thy word, in spite of everything around me, in spite of the hardships, in spite of the storms, in spite of the wildfires, in spite of the death all around me, in spite of the hurts that I have experienced, in spite of all of this, God, I will serve you. Because what other choice do you have, church? It's life or it's death. It's obedience or it's disobedience. You choose. And you choose exactly how close to God you want to be through your obedience. So in spite of everything, God, I will. I will. So let's be like Peter this morning when he said, nevertheless, at thy word I will. So we've gone through this lesson. I've gone through the story of this widow woman. I've asked you to put yourself in her shoes. I've asked you to put yourself in Peter's shoes. And if you've truly done that this morning, how have you responded? If you've honestly looked at it, how would you have responded? We all want to say that we would have done exactly what they had done. We all want to think that we would have. But only you can answer the question of how would you have responded? Your very last meal and you're dying. How would you have responded to the requests of a man, a stranger, a man you've known, you've heard of, maybe you've seen him in passing, a man that you've been told is the prophet of God, but still a stranger because you don't know him? How would you have responded when he asked for that last bit of meal for you and your child? How would you have responded? So when God asks of you the very small things, step out of your pew with your hands raised and walk down the aisle of the church. For some, it's hard. And I'm not going to tell you it's easy for me because it's not. There's times that you feel like moving in a service and it's out of your comfort zone. And you sit there and, God, if that's you, if you're telling me to do this, let them sing that chorus just one more time. Okay, just another time. The third time, God, on the third time, I might step out and do what you've asked me to do. God, I can't go over and lay my hands on somebody and pray for them. They're going to think I'm crazy. The small things that God asks of us, how do we respond? Do we respond in obedience, or do we stand there and bargain with God? This woman hesitated. When Elijah asked for her last bit of food, she hesitated. But when he told her that God said, she did. God said, if you will. And God says, if you will, I will. If we obey God, there is a reward for that obedience. And there are times that we have to come out of our comfort zone. There's times we have to put our feelings aside. And we have to do what God has asked us to do. The reward of obedience for us is life and death. There is two choices at the end of this life. And you choose which one you go. You choose which one you receive. There's life or there's death. The reward of obedience is eternal life. And as you go through and you read the Bible and a description of heaven, and you sit there and you say, streets of gold, gates of pearls, walls of jasper, beautiful stones everywhere. No dying, no crying, no pain, no hurts. All of that is stuff we cannot imagine. We can say it, I can say it, and I can make it sound amazing because it is. But I cannot imagine it because I've never seen it. When you eat something that you've never eaten before and somebody says, what does it taste like? You're comparing it to something you already know. And most times it tastes like chicken. Doesn't matter what it is. If you've never had it and it tastes different, it must taste like chicken. Right? But heaven is something we cannot imagine because there's nothing that we've ever seen that we can compare it to. We have seen gold. So we can say, okay, this is what those streets look like. But can you imagine streets paved with it? We've seen pearls, but can you imagine a gate made out of them? We've seen the beautiful rubies and sapphires and jaspers. We know what they look like, but have you ever seen walls made out of it? It's not something you can imagine because there's nothing to compare it to. This is the reward of obedience. This is the reward of saying, in spite of everything, God, I will serve you. In spite of all of my family that's against me, in spite of my friends that won't serve you, in spite of the church people that are leaving left and right, in spite of all of that, God, I will serve you because there's a reward after this life that we're striving for. There's a reward that we're going to receive that we cannot even imagine, but it's worth every discomfort that we face to be obedient to God. The only other option is hell. An eternity in darkness, an eternity of hearing weeping and crying and gnashing of teeth, an eternity of all of this. And this is what people choose. People choose this because they don't want to be obedient to God. Heaven or hell, it is a choice. There are some things in life we don't have a choice about. I don't have a choice of the family I was born into. I don't have a choice of the color of my hair unless I get it out of a box. I don't have a choice of the color of my eyes. All of that, God created me that way. I didn't have a choice in a lot of things in life, but this I have a choice in. I have a choice whether I want to serve God or not. I have a choice if I go to heaven or I go to hell. It is my choice. We choose each day to serve God. So be as Peter is. Nevertheless, God, in spite of all of it, I choose to serve you. I choose to be obedient to you. I choose Christ. In a world where you can choose anything, in a world that has said it's okay to be whatever you want to be. If you don't want to be a girl today, you don't have to be. I've heard teachers say I had kids identify as a fire truck. What does that even mean? What does it mean when somebody says I identify as something that I'm not? They're choosing to be something that they're not. But God has made us who we are, and He has made us with a choice to serve Him. So nevertheless, church, in spite of it all, in spite of the world that's gone crazy all around us, in spite of a world that thinks we're crazy for the way we live and the way we dress and the way we act, in a world that thinks everything is just opposite of what it's supposed to be, in spite of all of that, we can serve God. We choose to be different. So the reward of obedience, again, I'm saying, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but again, the reward of obedience is heaven or hell. The reward of obedience is heaven. The reward of disobedience is hell. We choose. So again, I say to you this morning, choose to be obedient to God. Be as Peter. Nevertheless, God, in spite of everything, I choose to serve you.